So people who avoid intimacy, they tend to put themselves down. They tend to receive reassurance from you about their own self-esteem. They're basically fishing for compliments sometimes, only using that in order to feel better about themselves. It's supposed to be like proof, basically, because they're not able to get it from themselves. So they're asking for emotional support without admitting emotional dependency. And from there, they typically use different things like alcohol with a conscious fog. You've got numbness, and then you've got drugs, which can be just a conscious high or conscious numbness as well. You have video games where to express your anger and whatever you want, you're able to take out the anger from the day, from your life, onto the video game and live somewhat a different life, or escape into a different life, or the media, or a TV, or your phone, or whatever, or sex, as a form of aggression or a demonstration of your anger and aggression towards whoever that is. It can also symbolize, in a way, a lot of the problems that happen. You have to think of the household. You have to think of what they experience, what you may have experienced, and why you are avoiding emotional intimacy, right? Or intimacy in general. One of the ways that you can tell you may be toxic is you don't like the idea of getting help, because, or the person does not like the idea of you getting help in that moment, because they feel like you're helping yourself, you're getting stronger, and they're not helping themselves. And so there's an emotional maturity that you're trying to form and trying to understand, and they may not be on that same level, may not be doing what they need to be doing. You can't talk about things that you don't know. There needs to be some knowledge behind all of this that I'm even exporting out to you guys. So that's what I'm going to give. So, anxiety is basically a temporal dislocation. You've got activator, belief, consequence. You've got activator as your seed, or the pain in which you encountered when you were innocent. And that is basically the past or the trauma that you will always take with you to the doorstep of whatever situation you go with. Then you've got the belief. The belief is the pain that you experience becomes what you believe about yourself. And you have the consequences, which is the decision and the self-sabotage, the disappointment, that all comes together. Because when you're self-sabotaging yourself and you're making a decision that completely goes against what you actually desire, you're setting yourself up for disappointment and dissatisfaction on one's life, deciding not to be happy because you don't believe you deserve it at all. A lot of this past trauma we experience is just trauma that happens to us when we're very young, and it's past trauma, and it's basically violated expectations that stopped you. It's when you were like basically stabbed in the back at some point when you were very innocent, and that past trauma begins to take over your present. It begins to take over the present, which obviously leads to consequences for the future. And when you don't see the world as it is, you're only seeing it as you are. You have to be able to get that support in order to change. If you don't change, you're going to continue that cycle of not understanding. You're being toxic not only to yourself, but you're treating people toxically because you don't understand that that is toxic. So we've got cells, which are technology that turn experience into biology, and that is basically that subconsciously happens all the time. You walk into a room and you assess potential threats because you've been hurt before yourself. And you see a threat, you are obviously able to run. But when you really experience a threat in your past trauma, you're very hypervigilant. You're on guard about 1,000 times more than you would normally be, or an average person, and your cortisol is just spiking at like a hyper anxious rate. It's at a panic state. And the present situation is probably perfectly safe for you, but you cannot process that because you come in coloring with all your past trauma that it has nothing to do with. Now, we conjure up a future that becomes identified with death and doom, and that leads to basically a panic attack every time you think of that future, even though it may be perfectly safe. You can't think of it because you're just reliving all these moments in your past trauma. And you have a panic attack in a very low stress situation because it's triggering past trauma you have not resolved. Past trauma is basically over determining what's happening now. And then you conjure up a future and it becomes okay, like I'm not okay, I'm dying, I'm in fear, things are not okay, I'm scared, and you won't admit it sometimes because that's a scary thing to have to do, to admit you're not okay, that something from the past is actually affecting you in the present. And so we repeat these cycles instead of addressing it somewhat and internalize. Now, the present is what is real. But sometimes that is hard for us to see when we're living off of a subconscious that is based off of being from your 2-year-old state to 7-year-old state. That's what you're going into with the world right now. And sometimes people are using their inner child and they're not able to have emotional maturity in certain situations because they're not resolving it. Now, when you start to panic, you have to allow that to eventually subside and understand that the past experience is not something that you should be bringing into the present, and realize that you're perfectly fine and learn from it, understand it and accept it. And those who are traumatized, their only goals is so overreactive. It's almost like they want to bring that past trauma everywhere that they go. And it's almost an optimal arousal. We're scared to admit that somebody has hurt us. Why? And it makes the pain real when we do that, you guys. We all have weaknesses. We're all superheroes, and we're all going into the day trying to save our world from our point of view. And when we don't understand that the pain is real, but you don't give yourself true healing time and you make excuses for it, you're not seeking true happiness. There's a dampening activity in the amygdala that is boosting activity in the frontal cortex, stimulating you while making you feel relaxed when you think of these things. And there's a Goldilocks zone that's a great space, basically, to resist past trauma without triggering, all of that anxiety response. And when you're going over the trauma and you're just revisiting it, you have to come to terms with it. You can't just keep replaying it. You have to learn to accept it and stop internalizing it, but be able to let that be something that helps you grow and not something that hinders you for the rest of your life. You have to banish it basically to the memory and stop thinking of it as a reality. Okay? Still in the present, but once you've understood and comprehended it, you can understand what has happened to you is horrible, but it's actually already in the past. Now, how do I know if I'm avoiding intimacy? How do I even freaking know? Well, you may be fearful avoidant or you may be dismissive avoidant. What are those, Sid? I'm going to explain to you guys. Let me explain. So, fearful avoidant is typically, they value intimate relationships. They experience high anxiety and codependency in their intimate relationships. They fear rejection. They have low self-esteem. They want to depend on others and be vulnerable, but feel deeply fearful and also distrustful at the very same time. They can also be exploited or used or inappropriately with connection when they were growing up. So they're exposed to connection, but it is very toxic connection, whatever it may be in the interaction. Now, the parent who's warm and loving on certain occasions and then deeply hurtful and promising on others. Now, they go back and forth with extremes that creates massive confusion and terror for the child. There is an anxious and avoidant tendency with them. They have lower self-esteem and then dismissive because their caregivers negatively impacted their sense of self. They long for connection and actively seek it, and they have a harder time in relationships because they shut down in the same way and not in the same extreme as the dismissive avoidant. If you're like, well, that doesn't really sound like me, okay. Now, those people typically pick unemotionally available partners to receive support, never having to truly deal with it or heal it, because their own partner doesn't deal with their own emotions. So if they're not even dealing with it, of course you're not going to actually ever heal it or deal with it. And you have a sense of selfishness because you want to only have to talk about yourself and you don't want to even think of your partner and what they may be going through. So you're picking someone already unemotionally available that cannot even open up. You're setting yourself up for failure for when you truly do want emotion and this person's not able to reciprocate. Now, dismissive avoidant, they tend to dismiss and block out connection in relationships. They shut down quickly when they become triggered. There's a sense of, oh, please, no, stop. I'm not doing this. I'm not doing this. There's a sense of they just push back almost as if hearing it is just too much for them to even comprehend. There's an emotional immaturity there. And they become triggered, and it's a very big blow-up type of thing. They have an anger side to where people are scared to approach them about anything emotional. It's almost like there's an inflated sense of self, because since they shut down so quickly when they become triggered, they often judge others as well. And they don't like to depend on others. Often career-driven, and they value their self, basically. Caregivers were very neglectful and dismissive of their needs, so they have few memories of wanting connection. They stop searching for connection, and they support externally for their loved ones because it was rarely responded to. And their defenses to internally basically cope to protect themselves from having to depend on anyone. And they appear very arrogant, often extremely career-driven, and they derive satisfactions from things outside of relationships because they can't even deal with the connection with themselves. They can't deal with connection with others. So one of the things that they do is they pick emotionally dependent partners to fuel their ego without ever having to deal with their own emotions while receiving love that they themselves do not have for themselves, and they cannot even reciprocate to that person. So they're setting themselves up to not only disappoint someone but hurt someone and put someone else in a situation where they're not able to get that love back. So sometimes these things happen, and how do we heal ourselves essentially so we can move forward? Well, with Fearful Avoidant, the main thing that you have to think about is you have to learn how to understand and comprehend your own trauma in order to accept what has been done is not who you are. And you deserve to be treated as who you are, essentially. Not as what you've been treated as before in the past, but who you are in your heart and in your mind and in your soul and body. Now, dismissive needs to learn how to embrace more of their own feelings and emotional trauma, which have long been dismissed. They feel like they don't deserve to feel happy. They need to help create a powerful bridge with other people in a sense by being able to be empathetic, vulnerable, and have a sense of connection. They have to be able to learn to be with others' feelings and to better their own feelings as well. They have to learn how to deal with that before they can truly heal and understand that it's not real. What you have been through is not who you are. You have to process true thought with knowledge, emotion, and empathy to connect to another person. You don't feel a need to use words that don't even mean anything at all. When you are really trying to connect to another person and be empathetic and use that knowledge and emotion and stop seeking love and just find it in yourself and it'll find you. You also need to understand you may have more emotional maturity than they have even experienced. Like they may have been through completely different things than you, and you may be at a higher consciousness than them. You may be actually improving and they're not. You have to be aware of that and be able to understand how to be an empath while still not being codependent, essentially. So empath, you're basically going to say, I hold space for your emotions. You're not going to say, I'm going to take on your emotions as my own. You're going to say, I see why you would think, feel, and believe what you do. You're not going to say, I want to think, feel, and believe what you do. You're going to say, I can sit with your suffering. You're not going to say, I can fix you. You're going to say, I'm not immune to anxiety, but I access spaces of calm often. You're not going to say my life feels like a roller coaster of one crisis to the next, basically. You're going to say I'm comfortable with a spectrum of emotions. You're not going to say I have an emotional addiction. You're going to say my relationships are generally fulfilling. You're not going to say I'm always taken for granted and feel drained.